Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Naples Mitchell. I'm the program director here at the Kennedy School's Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policies program in criminal justice policy and management. This is our spring speaker series on surveillance, criminalization, and punishment. And today we are delighted to have a panel to talk about surveillance in prisons and jails, and in particular, kind of new terrain for surveillance, building on the series that we've had so far, focused on other forms of law enforcement, investigation, surveillance, prosecution. And we will end our series next on May 8th with an event about counter-mobilization and community control. So that is the kind of a story arc of this entire series. I want to start just by reminding folks about how we run these events. So this event is being recorded, as you'll note, and we encourage people to engage in the chat with sharing resources or asking questions during the conversation. We will use that set of questions in the chat as a cue to invite people when we pause, hopefully around 5:15, to ask their questions directly of our speakers. And if you have an additional question at that point, you can feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand with the raise hand function in the Zoom. Again, we like to share resources as we go through. So as our speakers mention things, I will try to drop them in the chat and monitor the chat, but our speakers do not have to feel responsible for monitoring any activity there. And I will start by introducing the three wonderful guests who are joining us today. Their full bios are on our website, which is also where the video will ultimately be posted, but I will read slightly briefer versions for each of you. So first, Nila Bala is joining us from the faculty at UC Davis School of Law, which she joined this academic year in 2023. Her research focuses on children's rights and the criminal justice system, as well as emerging technologies. Prior to joining the faculty, she had been a director of legislative initiatives and a senior attorney at the Policing Project at New York University School of Law, and then the assistant director of criminal justice policy at R Street Institute prior to that, where she led R Street's criminal justice policy to advance reforms in juvenile and economic justice in particular. Prior to that, she had been an assistant public defender in Baltimore, where she handled more than 1,000 cases in her tenure and worked also systemically on trying to address the problems of money bail. In that system, she hails from Yale Law School, where she received her law degree and where I knew her many years ago. So very nice to reconnect. And also clerked for the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas. Beryl is an investigative researcher at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She focuses her work on government transparency, law enforcement surveillance technology, and other uses of technology by government actors, and has extensive experience in particular with using freedom of information laws or FOIA laws, or FOIL in the state of New York, depending on where you are. At EFF, Beryl supports the Atlas of Surveillance, the FOILES, and the Catalog of Carceral Surveillance, among other projects. And prior to working with EFF, she spent 7 years as a projects editor at Muckrock, where she focused on prison privatization and other public-private partnerships. Daniel Schwarz is a privacy and technology strategist in the policy department of the New York Civil Liberties Union, where he focuses on algorithmic accountability and smart city projects. He is an artist and technologist working on issues of privacy and surveillance broadly. His artistic practice examines control and power structures, state authority, border politics, and cartography in connection with the larger surveillance complex. And he has a wide variety of artistic achievements that I won't rattle off, but that you should all go scope out. So thank you to all three of you for joining us with really a great diverse set of varied perspectives on this set of issues. I think we're going to start by laying a foundation and talking about sort of the broader issues of surveillance in prisons and jails before we dive into some of the emerging technology issues. So let's start with that foundation. Prisons and jails are notoriously tightly controlled environments. What are the goals of surveillance in prisons and jails, and how might those be similar to or different from surveillance by law enforcement in other settings, including in the broader community? What are the basics of how surveillance is accomplished in carceral settings? How are people monitored? How are communications monitored? Maybe Nila, you can lead us off, and then we'll go to Beryl and Daniel.
Happy to do so. Katie, thanks for having me. Thanks to the Harvard Kennedy School and the Center for having me. really excited and thrilled to be a part of this. There's so many questions in that, so I'll try to unpack a few and just do a little bit of background, because I know we're going to get into some of the intricacies with the emerging technologies in some of our later discussion. But going to the first question of the goals of surveillance and what does it mean to monitor people in the carceral system. So the main goal that people will articulate is safety and security, right? So preventing prison breaks, preventing violence, preventing misconduct, preventing all of those issues from happening within the prison. And when you ask the question of, are the goals the same as sort of in the outside world or the broader community? There are more constraints in carceral facilities, and thinking about the way the legal system has treated individuals' privacy rights and constitutional rights, they are not the same, right? There's a diminished expectation within these facilities, and we can certainly talk about whether that should be so. But the language that courts often use is, as long as there's legitimate penological goals for the reason that there's security and surveillance, typically courts defer to prison administrators. Some of the other goals I wanted to highlight that I've heard with regard to surveillance, one is actually reducing the amount of corruption within the prisons. So kind of watching the watchers, watching the guards. So bribery, corruption, misconduct by guards, having there be more camera footage and surveillance regarding that. Other things I've heard, medical uses. So recently using surveillance to quickly flag if there are physical issues, like maybe related to TB or COVID or other contagious diseases, mental health issues, if people are acting in certain behavioral fashion, suicidal ideation, things like that. And then finally, another goal is to free up some of the staff who are spending all their time apparently monitoring and surveilling. Let's give technology some of that so that people can focus on helping individuals who are incarcerated with rehabilitation goals and sort of use their time in better ways. So those are some of the articulated goals of both traditional surveillance and then kind of this new world surveillance we're seeing now with emerging technologies. I'll say two more sort of themes, and then I want to make sure I pass it off. One is just this general theme, which I'm sure we're going to hit on throughout this conversation, that at least I don't believe that surveillance can fix the carceral system or fix the problems we see within the carceral system. Some of what we might talk about, you might feel like there are some good goals in there, but it has to follow kind of a revolution, not sort of start any sort of revolution in fixing the carceral system and the mechanics we have. And then the second thing I want to highlight is 95% of individuals who are incarcerated will be released. And so you might ask yourselves what you're willing to tolerate within and behind bars, knowing that individuals are going to be outside, and what kind of democracy do we want to live in? What sort of democracy do we want to support? These are individuals who are part of our society. They are not apart from us. And so we might justify some of the things that these individuals are being put through because saying, okay, they committed a crime, they're behind bars. But I would really ask us to kind of interrogate that notion.
Thank you for that. Beryl, anything to add on those initial themes?
I think definitely when we're thinking about this safety element, which is the sort of rallying cry around this technology and police technology, we sort of open up the landscape of opportunity to use safety as the umbrella by which we are trying to push forward additional policies, right? And so I guess I would also highlight, right, that not only is it the safety that is, being sort of pushed forward as a reason for some of this technology, but sort of behind the scenes, we're seeing a lot more around the investigatory uses of the surveillance. And also, similar to the context outside, there are like really big questions about the extent of the surveillance and where the limits of the surveillance should be, and how far the data that is being collected on that surveillance is following us into the rest of our lives. And so, as Nila very properly pointed out, most of these people are going to go in, they're going to serve their time, and they're going to go out into the rest of society. And are we going to see that these people are going to be compromised repeatedly once they are released? And I think that's something that we see very frequently when we deal with surveillance in the policing context or in the public space in general, is how much information are they really gathering? How much networking is being, or network mapping is occurring? And also in what other spaces is that information that was gathered in a particular context going to be used to inform decisions around how they're able to live the rest of their lives?
Thank you for that. Daniel, anything to add?
I think those are all fantastic points, and I would just add, with regards to your question, how this type of surveillance differs from different forms of surveillance in the communities by law enforcement or immigration enforcement or other government entities, that we see basically the entire gamut in the prison and the carceral systems and in jails. And because of the comprehensiveness that incarcerated people are surveilled, there's perhaps differences there because it's possible to have a much more comprehensive form of surveillance types in those settings as opposed to other communities at large. But it runs the whole gamut from all the various forms of surveillance that we're probably diving into in the next few questions. But whether that's accomplished over sensors or over cameras, over automated decision systems and AI. And oftentimes we have seen those being deployed in prisons first and then being deployed wider out into other communities and infrastructures, whether that's schools or hospitals or places of public accommodations for that matter. And likewise, what we have seen here in New York specifically is really the shrinking of privacy rights for incarcerated people, where maybe 15 years ago, it was still a requirement to get a search warrant to record calls. That has all fallen down the wayside, and with voice recognition technology and all the vendors that have encroached on that market, I think we're really, or incarcerated people are not left with much privacy protections and or transparency. Any safeguards, limitations have all fallen off the wayside.
Yeah, bleak opening for us to then dive into the substance a little more together. And I think one other kind of foundational question in this that I think is helpful to tease out for our audience is, who are the players in this, right? We know carceral systems are government, run. They're in departments of correction or county sheriffs, but also there are other private companies and profit motives behind some of this technology, right? So I wonder if we could talk about those dynamics a little bit and lay out sort of the political economy behind this kind of surveillance infrastructure. Who are the major players? How do they build up contracts? Beryl, maybe you can start us off.
Sure. So I think sort of the core of the technology in prisons that people are used to talking about have to do with the phones and the ways that people are able to communicate with people on the outside. And certainly when we're looking at the phone space and now the tablet space and video visitation space, there are a couple of very key players. So there's a company called Schwarz, which is now run by a company called Inventive Technologies, which is now owned by a venture capitalist fund called Platinum Equity. And Schwarz is one of the very big players. And then there's another company called Global Tellink that has rebranded as ViaPath. And you'll see sort of throughout, right, the policing and the prison space, a lot of these companies will rebrand or they'll end up in a different umbrella. And in some of those transitions will claim to have sort of different policies or principles driving their business model, but at the end of the day, it is a business model with a bottom line that is accountable to all of these shareholders and investors. And so regardless sort of who is owning this particular company at any given time, I would suggest that, the motivations remain the same. And in the way that, in particular, these two big players have been able to get a large part of the market, but is also relevant to all of the smaller players, and there are regional smaller players, is the premise or the fact that people in these institutions don't necessarily have a right to be making phone calls or communicating with the outside world as we would do on the phone or via Zoom as we are right now. And so there has been a whole sort of infrastructure built up around basically getting buy-in from the facilities themselves, right? So for a long time, the way that these prison phone companies were working is that there would be a commission as part of their contract with each facility, and they would basically agree to provide maintenance and equipment and all of the sort of customer service associated with these technologies. And in exchange for having access to their these clients, for having access
Sorry
to
about that. If anyone's not speaking, if you can mute, that would be super helpful. I'm sorry, Beryl, about that.
fine. the facilities themselves would get a commission as part of the cost for placing these phone calls. And, a few years ago, there was action from the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission to try to cap the costs of these phone calls because they were just skyrocketing costs that did not line up at all with the technological advancements that had been made in communications. And so people were paying, many dollars a minute basically to make phone calls on systems that were really terrible and did not actually provide a reliable service. These companies have sort of shifted their business models a bit because there has been a lot of pushback on the phone call front. And there's a big move now, right, into tablets and what can tablets facilitate within the prison space. We're seeing a lot of the same issues, but also, right, there's a whole world of other technologies that are being implemented within prison walls. Whether those be sort of the biometric trackers that we briefly touched on, video cameras, biometric monitoring. And so there are a whole bunch of other players now who are in this space trying to get a piece of the market.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think the only other thing that I wonder is, when we talk about these companies, right, there's some clear kind of questions about exploitation and expense, right? And I wonder if Nila or Daniel, you have anything to add about, so kind of what are the concerns in the advocacy community or in scholarship about how that plays out for individual harms?
I think there's so many layers to this, and there's so many exploitative and problematic practices, deceptive practices. So in addition to what Beryl said, I think with Securus specifically, we also have this example of quid pro quo contracts and deals where the vendor Securus convinced certain jails and prisons to no longer allow in-person visitations, that they had to rely on the expensive and exploitative call platform from Securus. There's also been various steps by Securus to prohibit physical mails and packages to come in. So again, to shift the entire communication infrastructure over to the vendor platform. They're not just doing calls, they also facilitate the digitization of mail and of packages, as well as facilitating a digital messaging system. Again, all the messages obviously go through their natural language processing. They do AI flagging, a lot of surveillance technologies included in there. So I think those are various problems, and I see, oh, perfect. Thanks for sharing that link, Katie.
No problem.
And then I think the other aspect to that is that we see a lot of free pilots or other types of scenarios where vendors go in and offer the jails or prisons, the DOC, DOCCS here in New York, free trials or completely free services that the government doesn't have to pay for them, but rather all the cost is then fully covered by the incarcerated person or their families or the people they reach out to. So that is also something that happens very frequently. And on top of that, the other gain that vendors stand here is benefiting from all that data that they can collect and use to train the AI for the future. And as we all are aware, data is so advantageous for them, and the data that gets collected in those facilities are obviously very rich and allows for many forms of exploitation and later use, third-party use, beyond its initial collection purpose. And then maybe the other incentive structure that we have to consider here is also all the federal and state grant money that is being made. And a vendor that here stands out in New York is Leo Technologies. So again, like Securus and what Beryl mentioned earlier, ViaPath or Global Telink, Leo Technologies offers a similar voice recognition system. It's built on top of the Amazon AWS cloud. It offers all these investigative tools. And here we've again seen, similar to a lot of the other surveillance vendors that are over-promising what their products can do. And over time, we see this shift in narrative and marketing claims, where perhaps initially they were marketing towards preventing any conspiracy, any scheming for future crimes by an incarcerated person or the person they're reaching out to. or bringing contraband into a prison or jail, to then during the COVID, it shifted towards identifying outbreaks just because someone mentioned sneezing on the phone. Then they marketed specifically towards prison and jails to prevent lawsuits against the administration there. During the Trump years, we've seen marketing claims that would be very advantageous against to strengthen gang policing with regards to MS-13. So the narrative shifted constantly, and basically they were trying to throw anything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And that's definitely been a wider motif amongst a lot of the AI and surveillance tech vendors that we're seeing here in New York.
I'll
Yeah,
just say a really quick word, I guess.
yeah, that's great.
One thing I wanted to highlight is the predatory contracts and the predatory pricing of these private companies that are providing these services has ripple effects both onto the folks who are incarcerated as well as their families. So one example with Securus, which, you know, is charging these exorbitant fees for these voice calls or video calls, is that if people have more than, so let's say you want to make a 20-minute call, you need $20. If you have more than $25 in your account, then you're not eligible for free sanitary and hygiene products. So you're often making these trade-offs between whether you use that money that's in your account for talking to your family and connecting with your family, or for getting hygiene products that you need. The other thing that, and we know this really from the youth justice side, but it's relevant for emerging adults and adults incarcerated as well, is the individuals who are footing these bills are often the families, right, that are outside. And again, we know that most people re-enter society. And so when you have these large fines and fees that these individuals who are already impoverished are bearing, it can really create resentment and animosity and make that re-entry process even more difficult as well. So there's all these sort of other effects of the predatory contracts that both Beryl and Daniel highlighted.
Yeah, that was such a great overview from the three of you, and really complementary responses to think about the way that these dynamics play out. And in particular, I think that point that you ended on, Nila, is also a good reminder that when we're talking about surveillance that's happening over the phones or over communication methods, right, that surveillance that's also reaching people in the community. It's not only reaching the people who are currently incarcerated, right, but it's sweeping out into communities directly from prisons, and as well as being piloted for potential use in law enforcement in a community setting. So I appreciate that point especially. I think, you know, you all have already peppered in lots of great examples of kind of the emerging technology forms, but I wondered if we could get a little bit more concrete with some of them. And I know, you know, Nila, you've written previously about this. Beryl, you've been working on the catalog of carceral surveillance. Daniel, you've done lots of related work as well. So I wondered if each of you could kind of give us some examples of what does this look like in terms of concrete technologies beyond the basics of, you know, recorded phone calls and camera systems. What are we seeing that's new? Nila, do you want to start us off?
Sure, happy to. So when I started looking into this 5 or 6 years ago, it was mostly prisons in China, Hong Kong, Malaysia that were starting this trend, but it's definitely here now. So when I look, you know, when I was revisiting this topic, I was like, oh man, it's come here. So what are we seeing? We're definitely seeing cameras that have augmentation with facial recognition, motion detection, and the purposes articulated can range from figuring out if individuals who are incarcerated are in like the correct areas or the authorized areas. It can be, the other articulated purposes could be like behavior management or detecting erratic behavior. That's a phrase I've seen. In China, they're saying that they can, and this is definitely snake oil, by the way, but accurately detect people's emotions using, again, facial recognition technology, and basically predict if an intervention needs to happen, if a person's plotting escape, or if they are different from normal for some reason, and therefore there's some intervention needed for that. There's Fitbit-like devices that prisoners are being asked to wear, individuals who are incarcerated are being asked to wear, that can monitor heart rate, obviously location data, even within a cell, telling you precisely where the individual is. And again, the idea being like maybe this physiological and biometric data could be helpful in terms of monitoring health issues and security related concerns. That's again, the articulated purpose. And then what else are we seeing? We're seeing Securus and Verus and companies like that using voice prints, which is considered a biometric, and AI to transcribe every conversation and actually monitor them for certain words. Similar things with mail. And then I guess the weirdest or grossest new tech that I can give you is robots searching feces for drugs. So that is also happening. I will turn it over to Daniel and Beryl to give us more exciting things that are happening and scary things.
I can go, yeah. Well, I would add a little bit more information about the surveillance aspects to what Securus that we already talked a lot about, but I think we didn't mention yet that this particular vendor has been notorious about also violating the privileged attorney-client calls and has been recording them throughout. So here in New York City, for example, an audit by the DOI showed that I think around 3,500 attorney-client calls have been recorded beforehand. The Intercept, I think it's been at this point almost 10 years ago, probably nine years ago, reported of a massive data breach where 70 million calls that Securus recorded nationwide were leaked, which also included over 10,000 attorney-client privileged calls. That is not an outlier. That is not limited to Securus. I've reviewed communications by Leo Technologies and the Suffolk County Jail that has been contracting with this vendor. And again, they are in the emails between the jail and the vendor after testing the technology for multiple months already. After I think 5 months, the staffer from the jail finally asked how he could turn on the setting that attorney calls would not be recorded. So you can see how this is definitely a larger and wider pattern across vendors. I would also add that Securus doesn't just surveil the incarcerated person. I mean, Nila mentioned already that obviously all the loved ones' communications, or attorneys for that matter, any other person's communications will be collected as well. But something that is really outrageous, in addition, that I think a lot of people don't know, is that Securus has a contract with phone service providers and internet service providers to provide the location information of the called person. And they claim, and I don't know whether that is still a core feature. The information is very scarce on that front. On the ACLU's website, I can put a link in the chat later where my colleagues.
I can drop that link for you.
Thank you, Katie. So that was at least in 2018 a core feature of the product, that every called person's location information was shared and accessed and included in the database as well. We have submitted FOILs to the Department of Corrections here in the state that's contracted with Securus. They don't have any policies in place. There's no transparency, no limitations or any guardrails, no training that really takes place. Similarly, with other biometric surveillance technologies, I think I can give one example on facial recognition, which I think the majority, or I think you already had Debraji talk a couple of months ago. So you're all experts on the issue of facial recognition, which I'm thrilled to hear about. And in New York State, all prisons and jails are utilizing facial recognition for visitors as well. So in addition to all the searches and scans that are happening and all the procedures that families and friends of incarcerated people have to undergo to visit their contacts, they also have to go through a facial recognition system that has been untested. There's no disclosures, no privacy policies. We only learned about it a couple of years ago through an intake where a visitor was denied entry, although the officer in that particular prison admitted that it was probably a false flag, and the visitor didn't look like anything like the person that he was matched with through the facial recognition system, yet he was still denied entry to visit their contact. We again filed a FOIL. We had to also go through Article 78 litigation to get the documents because they did not want to disclose any documents, and the documents we finally received were just a contract, heavily redacted. It doesn't seem to have any policies in place. They're not notifying impacted people. It doesn't seem that they have any procedures in place. What happens with a flag? If an error occurs, they don't have any statistics. by demographics, how accurate or not, or how biased the systems are. And that's not a new technology that they just procured, but rather it's been already in place for over a decade.
Yes. Beryl, I know you've got a bunch more examples, even beyond what we've already talked about. Will you give us a couple more?
Sure. So I think, a theme that we're sort of seeing in policing and in prisons also is, and just in general in our lives, is this joining together of all of these different data streams and trying to find a way to make saleable some of these different buckets of information that these companies have on each of us. And I think in the prison space, a few years ago, worked on a project that was looking at sort of patents and like sort of what was coming down the pipeline for prisons. And part of the motivation for this project was that we were in the middle of the pandemic, and all of a sudden, all of these companies were saying, we're giving away all of these free phone minutes and all of these free tablets. And when a company like that is giving away free product, they're not obviously giving it away for totally free. They have to find another way to recoup their costs. And so we were trying to understand sort of where they were repositioning themselves. And so I do just want to sort of highlight what has already been said about the tracking and the effect that this has on people who are outside of the prison facility, because we have seen through the tablet, which has become the main portal by which people are able to interact, a lot of the same tracking happens, not just on the outside, but also as they sort of move around their tablet, as they're interacting with people. We had seen designs on trying to use sort of elements of emails and other materials gathered through the tablets in order to do more targeted advertising to people on the outside. There was, interest obviously in voice prints. And as we've seen, this has absolutely become more prevalent in the prison space. And then I think we're also seeing a lot of the joining of some of these elements to the biometric part of things, right? And so this comes up, I think, in the safety space, if and gets sold within prison walls as being a way of trying to identify who might end up being violent. It is is somebody who is being held right now, are they going through some sort of medical crisis, or are they about to get into a fight? So I think we're seeing the use of these biometric trackers in coordination with the tablet information and with increasingly video information. And what we were talking about in terms of tracking people throughout the facility is important. Is an important element of all of this, because I think they are trying to get a very clear idea of where everything is in within that space. And then I guess I'm also glad, I just want to highlight what Daniel was saying also about the face recognition and also about the lack of boundaries around the use of this technology, right? So when there are voice prints created or transcripts created of all of these phone calls, it is an open question about who is actually able to conduct searches, what searches they're conducting, who is actually engaging with some of the data that is being collected. And if there aren't, both inside and outside of prisons, if there aren't clear guardrails, if there aren't clear audit mechanisms, then it can be very easy for that information to be abused. And as we know, there are a lot of antagonistic dynamics between correctional officers and prison authorities and the people who they're overseeing. And you can easily imagine that this type of surveillance can also be used against individuals if there isn't a way to actually keep track of how they're accessing it and utilizing it.
Such a good point, and really leads into the next set of questions, which are, I think we have teased out already some of the kind of privacy, civil liberties concerns, but also there are due process concerns embedded in all of this. So I wondered if you all could talk a little bit about that, to what extent, even though people have diminished rights after having been convicted of a crime, right, they still have certain rights to freedom of expression, they still have certain rights to freedom of speech, and they also have rights to due process. And in particular, since some of these technologies are being used to issue discipline in an automated way, right? What does due process look like in that context? Maybe Nila, you can lead us off again.
Sure. So I'll just say that I think with the surveillance increasing, we're seeing even more sort of onslaughts to free expression, to the little sort of liberties that individuals who are incarcerated still had. Certainly, even with traditional surveillance, the court doctrine has not been very favorable towards incarcerated individuals' rights. So monitoring phone calls, monitoring mail, all of that, the Supreme Court has essentially said, as long as, again, there's these legitimate goals related to safety, to security, that the prison can articulate, which they very easily can. Usually there's deference given to the prisons in creating this surveillance structure that monitors individuals. But like you also said, certainly there are still some concerns and some rights that remain even when individuals are incarcerated. But you know, as recently looking at the free speech and the free expression piece of it, and I think that's affected not only with individuals creating their own art and expression, which now I was just reading, they're even using AI to monitor what sorts of art people are engaging in and actually submitting that for internal review before individuals can engage in that sort of activity. But also with the advent of the tablets, there's been a reduction of books that are actually available. So book bans is something we've had, you know, in prisons for a long time. And many of the books that are on the list that are forbidden are books that truly do have good reason for individuals who are incarcerated to want to be able to access, both for their legal cases, but for their own enrichment. But with the advent of these tablets, a lot of these tablet companies are saying, well, you don't need these libraries. They're a security risk. There could be some drug smuggling coming in with the books, even though we know empirically that guards are actually far more likely to smuggle in drugs than individuals who are incarcerated. But anyway, now what they're reading is being monitored, and even some of the books that are free online are costing money for them to access. And in terms of every little thing that they're looking at online, all of that behavior is now being monitored as well. And then on the due process concern, I definitely think there's a concern there if there isn't actually a process to determine whether the thing that AI has flagged as problematic or as misconduct actually even took place. The flip side, and this is, I'll just end on a somewhat maybe optimistic note, not that we've actually seen it be used in this way, but I'm hopeful that, again, I was kind of alluding to this at the beginning of the talk, this idea that surveillance could potentially watch the watchers. So if individuals themselves are being accused of misconduct and they could use the same evidence to exonerate themselves, or if guards are abusing individuals, there is that potential, right? The technology itself could be used in a more positive way. I'm not saying we've seen it in that way because of who holds the power and who's actually controlling the surveillance.
Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add all the well-known concerns around accuracy and error rates. We don't know about the AI's data it's been trained on. We don't know what decisions have been made in its design, in the algorithms, what parameters are weighted, how. We don't know anything about the procedures, as I mentioned in the case of Securus and the facial recognition system. The DOC and the DOCCS in New York don't have any policies or procedures whatsoever. They have never asked for any tests or studies. We know with facial recognition how much more inaccurate it is for Black and brown people, for young people, for elderly, for non-binary people. All these biases are also reflected in other forms of biometric surveillance, whether that's voice recognition, where I think academic studies have shown that the error rates for Black speakers was twice as high compared to white speakers. We can only extrapolate or speculate about the error rates for non-English speakers, for immigrant populations. Leo Technologies, as an example, one of their big claims for gang targeting and gang surveillance was also their automated translation from Spanish into English, and all the we can only imagine all the errors that get embedded within those, and how many people are falling in the crosshairs there because of some arbitrary terms someone decided to utilize as a flag for gang membership, and that can be something as mundane as using a certain slang term that is in common usage, or perhaps through the CCTV camera wearing the wrong color on the wrong day.
Beryl, anything further to add?
I'll just underline or connect back to some of the marketing and profit motive in these systems. It would make sense if there were a particular policy or a particular identifiable need within a governmental agency like the prison system to then have, sort of objectives for the use of that technology and issues that it was actually trying to address. But, as we sort of see in a lot of these spaces where the surveillance and the private technology companies have outpaced the government in terms of what they're able or wanting to provide, there are these huge gaps in accountability and oversight and just basic policy making that really do just open up a whole world of possible abuses and enable them in a way that we haven't really been able to see before.
Thank you. Yeah, I have many more questions prepared, but I think we'll just skip to the last one, which is maybe a note of hope. So maybe we'll start with Daniel this time. You've done a lot of work in advocacy around surveillance and trying to create guardrails and sort of strategies for reining in the surveillance state. And I wondered if you could all give us some ideas for how communities are fighting back against these kind of tightening controls and more closed physical environments, even as more digital technologies are entering prisons and jails. And in particular, I imagine there are difficulties in working with a constituency where the most directly impacted people are behind bars. So, to the extent that there's this inside-outside organizing happening, I wonder if we could talk about those dynamics too, and then we'll pause for questions from the audience after this.
Yeah, super challenging. I think so. In New York State, we passed very progressive bail updates in 2019, and I don't know if you all have followed the unfortunate rollbacks of those and the continued weaponization of these, even by our democratic administration and legislators. And I think all the challenges that we see across the board for limiting surveillance, for strengthening privacy and digital rights are present in a much more amplified way for incarcerated people. And our strategy has been in a lot of our privacy legislation to ensure that we can cover incarcerated folks as well. So for example, our biometric surveillance ban for law enforcement would also cover correctional facilities based on the definition of who would be the covered entities. And based on the political temperatures at the moment, it's very, very tricky to get any surveillance tools limited or out of the hands of police or correctional officers. So it is always an uphill battle, but I think there's hope. As you preface that question, I think there is hope. We can, at the moment, I think, also benefit from that wave of attention on AI that is there in the broader narrative, and we can draft legislation and engage communities around that. And a lot of the proposals, how we can ensure accountability and guardrails on more sophisticated AI would also protect communities elsewhere. And as long as we center the most marginalized and impacted communities and include them in decision making and think of the impacts it has in those scenarios, and ensure that these laws or bills are drafted in comprehensive ways, I think that is one of the ways how we can tackle that. And obviously it is about including the impacted communities first and foremost. I think one other sliver of hope there is although progress is so slow, I think we always benefit even from this patchwork legislative framework that we have in the United States. So we see certain progressive proposals in perhaps certain cities or municipalities. We have some wins in one state, but not another, but it still helps protect the rights even outside of that jurisdiction. And I think that is also, again, like some hope that we can see. And even outside of the United States, with developments in the EU or elsewhere, vendors might also be forced, or it might be easier for them to just follow the strictest regulation, as we had seen with the GDPR, to create some protections elsewhere. And with the biometric privacy protections in Illinois, for example, the litigation there and the subsequent settlement against Clearview AI has also helped us elsewhere against some of the most nefarious practices by that vendor.
Beryl, you want to go next?
Sure. I think I am on board in terms of the optimistic view that there is, just generally more work being done around this. There's more awareness that that these are issues, and I think that the narrative is shifting around who our incarcerated people are, and I think that has been a huge struggle in all of prison advocacy work, is trying to challenge that narrative, particularly when there are people in power or people who haven't had people who have been part of the system. But so many people are part of our system, and we are also interconnected. And I think just in general, our communities are finding that there is a bit of an imbalance in how our policies are being made. And I think, within this prison space and within a lot of other surveillance spaces, we're seeing a lot of coalition building and a lot of shared notes and a shared belief that there is a better way to be doing a lot of crafting a lot of these systems and doing the work of existing in this American project. And so I do find that a bit of hope in all of this.
Totally agree with what Daniel and Beryl just shared. Along with the regulations that Daniel alluded to and the patchwork that we have, whether we're regulating facial recognition or these more Fitbit technologies that are collecting biometrics, I think we can take a step back and just ask ourselves, like, what surveillance even does for us. And so I think one possibility is really framing this from a public safety lens. Like, if public safety is really what you're looking for, then look at the places that have been most successful with their prison systems. So places like Norway and Germany, where they use a more dynamic security sort of model, which means prioritizing relationships between people over monitoring. And so again, if we really want to have reentry be successful and even the prison environment to be safer, the answer isn't necessarily more monitoring. I think we need to regulate that. Don't get me wrong, but let's take a step back and ask ourselves what it's even doing in the first place. And if we're using AI and using surveillance to solve our shortcomings in prisons, like hiring problems and not having enough individuals in there, and even with education, which I know we didn't talk about, but education in prisons, if we're using it to just replace education programs and teachers and sort of that human touch, it's not going to do that for us. So I think that's one thing I wanted to leave us with, which I hope is a somewhat optimistic note, in that if you're even looking at the public safety piece of it, which I know is the argument that we kind of started this whole conversation with, it's falling in that even. And then I'll also say, in terms of democracy and democratic accountability, one thing I want to leave us with as well is the idea that incarcerated individuals and system impacted individuals who have felonies should still be able to vote. They should still be able to be a part of our democracy. And that's not crazy if you look at other countries. It's not crazy even if you look at a few states in the United States. There are states that allow individuals who are incarcerated to vote. And so if we're talking about including impacted individuals, that's one thing we should also focus on.
Thank you for that. Thanks for leading that off. And I will drop a prison policy initiative resource about voting rights for people who are incarcerated. Here in Massachusetts, people had the right to vote in prisons up until the year 2000. And that was a pretty recent change. And there's been a strong movement led by incarcerated organizers to restore the right to vote in Massachusetts for a number of years. So definitely very topical for us locally. I'm going to pause here and open the floor. I know we've got one question in the chat already, but if others have questions that they want to start queuing up for, please do that. Jeffrey Myers, you have the first question. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering about the tablets, and there's a little bit of talked a little bit about that, but there's a lot of companies out there. I know, like Origin's a big one, that they offer educational curriculums. To some degree, they even claim to have like substance abuse information. They also use it for a very scaled down version of like a Zoom capability, right? So any concerns with these types of tablets, as far as, privacy concerns, anything like that? It sounds like, from what I gather, there seems to be kind of a concern that it's used to perhaps replace services that would typically be in person. And then also it sounds like it makes it easier to restrict like things like books. Is that anything else?
Thank you for the question. I'm sure there are many other things. So, who wants to start us off?
I gotta preface this that I'm not an expert on those issues. So I for example haven't heard of the Origin tablets. So there's probably a lot of nuance and details that I'm missing. But yeah, I would be worried of replacing in-person educational programs where it's much more possible to have a free discourse and exchange of ideas with something that happens on the monitor tablet where every typed word is keylogged, analyzed, shared with the authorities, where incarcerated people have to very much moderate their language and where it might chill their free speech and the exchange of ideas. I would also add that with those technologies, an area where I would work much more on is on school surveillance, and we're seeing similar surveillance technologies with GoGuardian and other vendors that have been procured primarily during the pandemic, as remote learning became the norm across New York State, and other very concerning technologies that have been rolled out as part of that. And I think we have seen very concerning impacts from those technologies and the growing market on those fronts.
The other thing I would add is just related to the opportunities for additional gouging that the tablets provide. So they are supposed to be portals or ways of getting to some of the educational material, but there are also a lot of opportunities to buy music or send emails or purchase other bits of entertainment or communication that just exacerbate a lot of the poverty issues that we already had when we were dealing with the cost of prison phone calls. And if a person is spending $2-3 on a song or $2-3 to send an email to somebody, these costs also add up. And so and to what extent do people in carceral setting really need to be subjected to additional advertising in the way that we are out here? I guess just the ways that all of this exploitation can continue to carry on and be amplified is a concern related to the tablets.
Yeah, just to echo, I think everything Daniel and Beryl said, and also the things you mentioned in your question about cost, about the replacement of books, about the replacement of in-person learning. Those are all issues. There's this great sort of site, and I was trying to find it, where there's like 80 individuals who are surveyed who are actually incarcerated, and they describe kind of their experience using the tablets. One thing I'll say is that if you ask most people who are incarcerated, they want tablets. Like they are happy to have them. Albeit with all the problems that we have mentioned, including also they mentioned lots of glitches, lots of battery issues, access being a problem, and then not being able to get help to fix those problems. The price gouging is definitely an issue where trying to even read a book, like I mentioned, even books that are free because the copyright's expired, like costing $15 to $20 just to read one book. And right now, when we're talking specifically about education and the use of tablets, it's two ed tech companies that kind of dominate the market, and the amount of sort of nonprofit companies in that sector is so small. And so there is a lot of the price gouging. And actually, when again looking at incarcerated individuals with tablets, one of the main complaints, if not the main complaint, besides the tech issues and the cost, was they don't have enough educational content on their tablet. So not all these tablets even have educational content. Some of them restrict it. And there are definitely questions and concerns about using the Pell Grant funding that individuals in prison are eligible for these like courses and e-universities because there's just not very much quality control as well on kind of the education they can access with those tablets. But one thing I do want to say is, as much as we've complained about tablets, if you ask individuals who are incarcerated, they do want it. It really is a lifeline for a lot of them.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point and such a good question. I would add one more thing on the educational front, which is just that so many people who are incarcerated have had deprived or school push out kinds of educational experiences leading up to their incarceration, right? That people are maybe learners who especially need a kind of hands-on tailored setting and structure for their education. And so doing this kind of self-taught through a tablet module may be especially inapt for the kinds of learners who are disproportionately represented in our jails and prisons. I know there are often issues around kind of learning disabilities and people needing accommodation in jails and prisons already failing to provide them. So then adding the layer of this kind of one size fits all digital approach feels really like a swing and a miss potentially. We got one other question that was direct message to me from Lanny Graham. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. So I'm aware, and possibly you are, of about 19 states that have some form of fledgling oversight that is somewhat independent of the Department of Corrections. And I was just wondering if any of you were aware of any of those sources of oversight, considering the surveillance issue.
Sorry, could you just clarify the type of oversight that you're referencing? Are these government agencies or nonprofit agencies?
Well, no, there's, as I said, there's about 19 of them, and they are all very different, and they've all been passed, I'd say, relatively recently. For example, Virginia is just getting off the ground. Some of them are independent. They are completely outside. For example, Pennsylvania has a form of oversight that's completely outside of the government. There are some of them that are under the aegis of the legislature. There are some of them that are under the aegis of the governor, which always makes me a little uncomfortable. But so the reason I'm interested, I'm very interested in oversight. And I think this has been an eye-opener for me. I think this is really an important issue that's being neglected. So I was just wondering if any of those states were getting it. They have ombudsman, some of them have ombudsman. So that's the...
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and I dropped a link in the chat for folks who want to learn more about this kind of fledgling structure from the Brennan Center, which has been doing some tracking, and also I think has I believe a blueprint for kind of what they think of as the need for independent oversight and what that could look like. I know my understanding is there's a real range in terms of the extent of independence and in terms of the structure of oversight, and also in terms of whether the kind of auditing entity has power to engage in enforcement after doing fact finding, right? And so that's just some general comments. I don't know if any of our panelists have a particular expertise and want to talk about, conceptually, even if we don't know on the ground how this is playing out, how these kinds of entities could be engaged in oversight around surveillance technology. Maybe that's a kind of better entry point for us, given what we know.
Well, I unfortunately don't have expertise in this area. I know that in New York, we have various outside oversight entities. So at the state, we have a commission of corrections that oversees the DOCCS. In the city, we have the Board of Corrections. And then with all the crises in Rikers, there has been a federal monitor. But unfortunately, that's quite outside of my docket. And as far as I know, they haven't really touched on the surveillance issues. The board in the city, for example, has been involved in the rule change in 2007, 2008 that was permitting then the recording of all calls, changing from the prior warrant requirement. But otherwise, I haven't seen them involved with regards to any of these surveillance technologies.
You all
Okay.
have thoughts on how they might be potentially able to like what in terms of knowing the players that are involved, right? There's both the kind of government entities and these sort of like private, contracted, often monopolist structures around these new technologies. I wonder if you all think that these kinds of outside independent oversight bodies would be useful vehicles for doing that kind of monitoring, or kind of what, going back to our question of hope, right? Is this a venue that would be useful to explore?
Well, I think one parallel we have is from the law enforcement side. So there have been similar sorts of oversight groups that have been created to police the police, right? And they've had varying degrees of success, but unfortunately, for the most part, I would say they have not been as successful as we've hoped for some of the reasons, Katie, that you mentioned, including enforcement mechanisms. If they have recommendations, like what teeth do those recommendations have? Do they have the power to actually launch their own investigations? Can they subpoena individuals? Can they actually get documents that they need when they're investigating issues? So some of these review boards are very limited in terms of both the power they have to look into issues and then to actually do anything about those issues. I will say over sort of the civilian review board, or if not civilian oversight type review board, what has been more successful, even generally to police law enforcement, is legislation, is regulation. And so I would say go towards that. It generally has more teeth, especially if you build in enforcement mechanisms. It's much clearer. And so using sort of the democratic process, and we've had success in certain states with enacting things like transparency regarding data, use of force legislation. And so the same sorts of legislation we've used to police the police outside of the prison walls, I don't see why we couldn't do more. And I think it was Daniel who mentioned that when they're looking at biometric technology, we're not just talking about folks on the outside, but folks on the inside. And so in the same way, kind of thinking about not just these questions that plague law enforcement out here in the broader community, but also within prisons as part of a legislative initiative.
I'm going to go ahead and +1 all of that and just add that, right, I think that these sorts of bodies have a part to play. I think if there aren't teeth to what they can do, I think that they are important in terms of being additional resources and being part of the community of civil society and academia and affected communities. So I wouldn't say that they are a bad thing at all, but there have been, when there are oversight bodies that need to be enabled by the power structure in order to be able to check the power structure, often they do not end up having all of the powers that they actually need to be effective in their roles. And so I think that they have another part to play as everybody sort of makes conversation and change around these issues.
I think we've exhausted our queue. Do folks have other questions? And if not, I certainly have more that I can offer. But I'll pause a minute just in case there's a burning question somebody is too shy to ask so far. Okay, seeing none yet. One of the things that we've touched on very briefly in this conversation, but kind of haven't really focused on, is how this affects staff who work in prisons also. And I wondered if we could talk a minute about that. There are obviously labor issues involved in the use of surveillance technologies. We had a talk earlier in the semester from Sarah Brain, who had written her dissertation and book project about embedding in the LAPD and understanding the kind of internal dynamics of the chafing of kind of line law enforcement against monitoring technologies of the performance of their own duties. So, when we're looking at the closed environment of jails and prisons, right, the surveillance technology that exists there affects everybody theoretically who is operating in that setting, including staff, including correctional officers, including volunteers who work in the prison system, including attorneys who are coming to do visits. So I wondered if we could talk about those dynamics a little bit too. To what extent does surveillance affect the way people perform their jobs? What are some of the kind of labor questions, and how might that also affect what contracts looks like with correctional officers unions or those kinds of things going forward? Maybe you can lead us off, Beryl.
Sure. So I guess, definitely wearing my EFF hat, we don't say that we oppose cameras in prison facilities whole cloth, because there are a lot of legitimate risks to being in that environment, and there are a lot of legitimate concerns that correctional officers have. And so, right, there can be ways that this can be used to sort of protect people within those spaces, but also, right, to penalize people within those spaces. And I think that this sort of comes back to sort of how they're getting implemented and what policies exist before we actually are in a moment of conflict to sort of outline what the appropriate path is for actually using those in performance reviews or to judge whether somebody is actually, performing their responsibilities appropriately. Another thing I guess I just sort of generally want to add in terms of context from outside prisons, right, is when we think about the ways that body-worn cameras have been used either as an accountability mechanism for the public, or as a way of reflecting back how law enforcement officers are performing their jobs, we do generally or have seen, right, like law enforcement officers will still abuse their position. There are lots of situations in which it would have been very nice to have body-worn camera footage, and yet somehow that body-worn camera wasn't activated or it fell off, or there are all sorts of other ways that that oversight does not actually occur. And that footage can be warped in a way to, again, present the prevailing narrative of the authority figures. And so I guess in general, right, there's always sort of this balance that we're trying to strike. But I think surveillance in a lot of cases just helps to bolster, some of what people already wanted to put forth as the prevailing issue or concern or general power structure.
We've got a couple more questions from the audience, so I'm inclined to move forward with those. Sherry, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks. I just wanted to ask and have some idea a little bit more about the surveillance tools that are used for that population that can now move outside the prison or would choose to move outside the prison, and what the effect it has on that individual and their own family, those around them, and how that links together with some of the new tools. Thanks.
Thank you. Who wants to lead us off?
Well, there's two things that come to mind immediately for me. One is just the idea that sometimes the sort of experiments we're doing within these facilities with people who are disenfranchised and really can't speak out are the same technologies we might want to one day bring into broader society or are already bringing into broader society. So that's sort of one way that the technologies that we're seeing start here are going to end up outside. But the other thing that comes to mind, and we didn't really touch on this, is the presence of surveillance and monitoring on supervised release. So probation, parole, community supervision. This is a huge issue. It could be its own panel. But everything from ankle monitors for individuals, both for pretrial supervision, so before they even have a conviction and they're just on supervised release pretrial, but also post-trial is one of the conditions of their probation or parole. Ankle monitors are fraught with many issues, but as this technology, as surveillance technology continues, I can see them using these Fitbit-like devices that I described on the outside. And in the UK, they're, the Fitbit devices they're using in prisons are also equipped with facial recognition and require individuals to check in 5 times a day. So we can just see that there's going to be this evolution of increasing information that they want on biometrics, on location data, on pretty much everything. And that is already pervading society in the sense that individuals who are on any form of supervised or community release are subject to it.
I think another area where we see an increase in technologies with regards to release is automated decision systems and AI for parole decisions. For community supervision release, I haven't seen any or have been able to test any of these technologies, and information is very scarce. There have been some federal reports. I think in general, as with all automated decision systems, lack of information, transparency, documentation, access, testing is prevalent here. I think we can look towards the seminal research there by ProPublica. I think it was at that time Julia Angwin looking into the pre-trial risk assessment tools, and a lot of these biases are likely to be also present in those systems. And without transparency, impact assessments, and especially then once an impact assessment has been done, setting the guardrails that if they show disproportionate impact, that they're no longer used or not, that they're prohibited to be used, I think is crucial. And at this point, we're not having the regulatory frameworks for those systems in place.
Thank you for the question. Go ahead, Beryl.
Yeah, sorry, two things that I would also add on electronic monitoring and the sort of public space are sort of connected to just the general surveillance that we're under right now. So and I guess I would also just sort of highlight the potential there is for more of this network mapping and more negative consequences to those who happen to be in the vicinity of people who have been involved in the criminal justice system. And so right now we know that law enforcement, just like advertisers and other people, can purchase advertising location data, which is essentially allows them to sort of geofence a particular area, sometimes without a warrant, and to be able to sort of track and then later identify everybody who is within a particular space. And so, you know, you can imagine that that can be used in vicinity to somebody who is on electric monitoring or in conjunction with some of the other sort of monitoring capabilities that our phones and this data has. We've also seen that there have been moves by certain jurisdictions that have been trying to implement and integrate more of their public surveillance cameras and private surveillance cameras in such a way that if somebody is on electronic monitoring, they would also like to be able to just basically jump into a camera on the street and see what that person is up to at any given time. And so that goes a bit beyond just sort of seeing them as a dot within a space, but really means that almost any moment they could be, if they leave their home or, you know, a private space, that they could be subject to extensive surveillance, and anybody who is like with them would also be subject to that surveillance. And then I guess one more thing about electronic monitoring is just also that there is, again, this profit motive, and Vera Institute has put out a recent report that's talked about a lot of this. But, you know, depending on the jurisdiction, the costs of actually being on that electronic monitoring fall to different individuals. And sometimes, you know, there are these sort of like kickback schemes between like judges and the companies. And then, you know, the people who have been released are having to pay all of this money so that they can be tracked all of the time. So I think just sort of it really expands, you know, the carceral space to be part of the public space.
Thank you for that. We are at about time, but we had one more question, which I think is kind of a brief answer maybe. So Maya, I'm going to ask your question because I see you say you're off screen today, multitasking. Wondering if you have seen any differences in the tech and surveillance contract types with publicly owned versus private prisons. I know private prisons are a very small slice of the actual footprint of the carceral system, but they take up a lot of our imagination. And also they do end up being, you know, kind of particularly nefarious playgrounds potentially for this kind of profiteering. So I wondered if anyone had a comment on that as a closeout. Seems like the answer may be no, which is totally okay.
I think we're challenged there by the lack of public records requests and the difficulty of getting any information. I mean, even with public prisons, we're oftentimes stonewalled and our requests are being denied. We have to go through litigation. And as we've seen with our NICLU cases here, even then we're not getting the actual information we're seeking. And that is even more so with private prisons. So hopefully some investigative reporters can get access to some of those contracts and deals with surveillance vendors, but I'm not aware of any.
I guess I would add, you know, a lot of private detention facilities tend to hold people within the immigration detention system. And we have absolutely seen in that context, at least, right, a move to something like electronic monitoring, to app-based monitoring. And also we know, because there have been sort of anti-immigrant groups that have purchased this information, that they are also able to sort of buy that advertising location data and sort of geofence these areas and track individuals. And so I think, you know, in terms of sort of a difference, you know, we see people in that space have even fewer rights than people who are regular, you know, American citizens. And some of that very highly sensitive information apparently is available for purchase in a way that maybe people who are on standard jail or prison electronic monitoring would not have their information out there and available. And I think that's just like wildly dangerous. And I don't understand, even working in the space as we all do, there are just sometimes moments where it is just a moment of awe in the worst way at how some things are still allowed to happen.
Thank you for these phenomenal comments and for each of your unique work and wonderful contributions today. This is the end of our program, but you know, this video will live on our website. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing your exceptional work.